My name is Maya, and I'm 25. Life's been unconventional, to say the least. I live with my grandma and have for as long as I can remember. See, my mom passed away when I was just a little kid, and my dad, well, he took off shortly after. 5 years old, that's all I was, when he left me with my grandparents and vanished. No siblings, no aunts or uncles, just me and Grandma and Grandpa. I used to ask about him all the time. When's Daddy coming back? Grandma would just give me this sad smile and tell me not to worry. Eventually, I got the message. He wasn't coming back. My grandparents were in their 50s when they took me in. They weren't well off, but they were the best. They made sure I never felt like I was missing out. I wasn't spoiled or anything, but they provided for me, worked hard to give me a good life. Grandma was tough, always working odd jobs, whether it was at the grocery store or cleaning houses. She never complained, always had a smile for me, always took care of me. I remember how proud I was when I started school. Grandma saved up to buy me this little backpack with cartoon characters on it, bright pink, and I carried it everywhere, even when I wasn't in school. I wore that thing out in a month. I know it wasn't easy for them to get me things like that, but they always found a way. As I got older, I started to realize just how hard they were working to keep everything going. Grandpa, before he got sick, had a steady job at the post office. He was a quiet man, but you could tell he loved me, even if he didn't say it much. He'd sneak candy into my lunchbox, let me stay up past bedtime when Grandma wasn't looking. Little things like that. By the time I reached high school, things were getting complicated. School was a big deal to me. I was always good at studying, doing my homework, all that. I had this dream of going to a really good high school, not just any public school, but one of the top ones. It felt like a way out, like I needed to do something with my life to make everything worth it. I remember this one conversation I had with Grandma when I was in middle school. We were eating dinner and she casually said, "You know, Maya, don't stress too much about going to a public high school. Choose the one you like." I didn't get it then, but looking back, I know she was worried about the money. Private schools are expensive, and even though they never said it, I knew they were struggling. "But what about you and Grandpa?" I asked. "Isn't it going to be tough if I go to a private school?" She just smiled and shook her head. "We'll manage," she said. "We've got some savings." That's how she always was, trying to make everything seem okay even when it wasn't. But I wasn't dumb. I knew they were doing everything for me. So I made a promise to myself that I was going to work hard and get into the best public high school I could. I wasn't going to let them spend money they didn't have. I studied like crazy. Late nights, early mornings, flashcards everywhere. And when the entrance exam came, I aced it. Got accepted into one of the best public high schools around. I'll never forget the look on my grandparents' faces when I told them. Grandpa, who barely ever said a word, got up from his chair, came over, and gave me this huge hug. I swear it was the first time I ever saw him cry. They were so proud of me. I think that was the first time I really felt like I was doing something right. You know? Like, I was paying them back for everything they had done for me. Grandpa even booked a table at this nice restaurant in town to celebrate. We didn't do things like that often, so it was a big deal. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world that day. High school wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, though. A couple of years in, things started to change. I'd come home from school, and the house felt different, heavier, like a cloud was hanging over everything. I remember walking into the kitchen one day and seeing Grandma sitting at the table, her head in her hands. I asked her what was wrong, and she looked up at me with these tired eyes and said, "Grandpa's sick." I didn't know what to say. I mean, what do you say to that? I was just a teenager, and I didn't understand how serious it was at first. But it got bad. Real bad. Grandpa was in and out of the hospital, and every time he came home, he looked worse than before. He stopped working, and Grandma had to pick up more hours at her jobs just to keep things going. I felt so helpless. I couldn't do anything to fix it. I tried to keep up with school, but it was hard to focus when all I could think about was what was happening at home. I'd stay up late studying, but I'd also be worrying about whether Grandpa would be okay. Grandma was always so strong, but I could see the cracks. She was exhausted. There were days when she'd come home from work, sit down on the couch, and just stare at the wall for what felt like forever before she'd get up to make dinner. I started helping out more, doing whatever I could, cooking, cleaning, whatever needed to be done. I didn't want her to worry about me on top of everything else. She'd always tell me, "Don't worry, Maya, focus on your school. You've got a bright future ahead." But how could I focus on school when it felt like everything around me was falling apart? Grandpa's condition kept getting worse. It was this slow, painful decline. One day he'd be okay, and the next he'd be back in the hospital. I hated it. Hated seeing him like that. Hated seeing Grandma so worn out, and hated that I couldn't do anything to make it better. That's when things really started to hit me. Life wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fair. And it definitely wasn't going to be what I expected. Grandpa's diagnosis was a turning point. It wasn't something I could ignore anymore, and honestly, I didn't want to. Every time I walked into the house, it felt heavier, like this weight I couldn't shake off. Grandpa wasn't just sick. He was fading fast, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I was a teenager, and I'd never seen someone I loved just disappear like that. Grandma tried to keep it together, but I could see how much it was taking out of her. She didn't complain, but you could just tell. There were days she'd come home from work, her shoulders slumped, like the weight of the world was on them. She'd smile at me, ask about school, make dinner like she always did, but it wasn't the same. We both knew it. Grandpa was in and out of the hospital so much I couldn't even keep track of the appointments anymore. Some days he'd be there for a week, other times just a few days, but each time he came back he looked worse. It was like watching someone slowly fade away. He used to be this strong, quiet man, and now he was weak, tired, and couldn't even get out of bed half the time. It was tough to see. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I was just a kid. Grandma was the one holding everything together, or at least trying to. She started taking on even more part-time jobs. It wasn't just about paying the bills anymore. There were hospital costs, medications, everything. And even though Grandpa had insurance, it didn't cover everything. I didn't really understand the financial part of it back then, but I knew we were struggling. I could hear her late at night, talking on the phone with the hospital, trying to figure out payment plans, arguing with them sometimes. I tried to step up, to help out more around the house. I'd make dinner if she was late, clean, do laundry, anything I thought might take some of the pressure off. I even got a part-time job at the local store to bring in a little extra cash. It wasn't much, but it was something. But no matter what I did, it didn't feel like enough. And honestly, it wasn't. How could it be? The worst part was seeing Grandpa like that. I'd come home from school and go straight to his room to check on him. Some days he'd be asleep. Other days he'd be sitting up, trying to act like everything was fine. He'd tell me stories or try to crack a joke, but even that was fading. There was this one day I'll never forget. I walked into his room, and he looked up at me with this weak smile and said, "Maya, I'm sorry." I didn't know what to say. Sorry for what? For being sick? For not being able to be the grandpa I remembered? I just sat there with him, holding his hand, not knowing what to say. Because what do you say to that? Nothing I could say would fix it. As time went on, things just kept getting harder. Grandpa had retired by then, and it was all on Grandma to keep us afloat. I could see how tired she was, but she never let on. She'd say, "Don't worry, Maya, I'm fine." But she wasn't. She was running herself into the ground, and I knew it. There were days when she'd come home from work, and I could tell she'd been crying, but she'd never admit it. That wasn't her style, and then there was the hospital. It felt like every other day there was some new complication with Grandpa's health. The doctors would explain things to me, but I didn't understand half of it. I just knew it wasn't good. One night, Grandma and I went to visit him, and he was hooked up to all these machines. He was barely awake, and when he saw us, he tried to smile, but he couldn't. That's when it hit me. Like, really hit me. That he wasn't going to get better. I didn't know how to deal with that. How do you prepare yourself for losing someone you've lived with your whole life? Someone who's been there every day, even if they weren't the loud, talkative type? I felt like I was losing my whole foundation. I'd go to school, trying to focus, trying to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. My friends didn't really get it. They'd ask, "How's your grandpa?" And I'd just say, "He's okay." Because what else could I say? No one my age was dealing with this stuff. They were worried about grades or what they were doing over the weekend, and here I was, worrying about whether my grandpa would make it through the night. Grandma started talking about applying for assistance from the government. We'd always been able to manage, but now we needed help. I didn't know much about how that worked, but I could tell she didn't want to do it. She was proud, and asking for help wasn't in her nature, but we didn't have a choice. I remember the day she went to the city office to apply. She came home with this big stack of papers, all these forms she had to fill out, and I could see the frustration in her eyes. "It's confusing," she said, sitting at the table, staring at all the paperwork. I sat down with her and helped as much as I could, but it felt overwhelming. Eventually, we got through it, and a few weeks later, we got the approval. I thought that would make things easier, but it didn't. It just made everything feel more real. We were now officially on assistance, and that felt like a loss in itself. As Grandpa's condition worsened, I could see the toll it was taking on Grandma. She was still working, still doing everything she could, but it wasn't enough. It never was. There was one night after Grandpa had another bad episode where she just broke down. I'd never seen her like that. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands covering her face, and just cried. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't because I didn't believe that myself. We were running on empty, and it felt like no matter how hard we tried, we were just sinking deeper. I was scared. Scared for Grandpa, scared for Grandma, and honestly, scared for myself. What would happen if we lost him? How would we manage? I had all these questions swirling around in my head, and no answers. Then, one day, after Grandpa had been in the hospital for a few days, we got the call. I don't remember who answered it, but I remember the silence that followed. The kind of silence where you just know something bad has happened. Grandpa had passed away. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there numb, like my brain couldn't process it. He was gone. Just like that. And everything we'd been holding on to, all the hope that maybe he'd get better, it was gone too. That night, Grandma sat with me on the couch. She didn't say much, just held my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like a kid again. A scared, lost kid who didn't know what the future held. After Grandpa passed, everything felt strange. The house was too quiet, too empty. He had been sick for a while, but somehow we always hoped he'd come home again. When that didn't happen, I think both Grandma and I just felt kind of lost. It's not like we talked about it or anything, but the way we moved around the house, avoiding certain rooms, staying busy, it was obvious. I threw myself into work. I had graduated high school by then and had to put off college to help out at home. There was no way I was going to leave Grandma alone, especially not after everything she'd done for me, so I found a full-time job at a local store. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and that's what we needed at the time. Grandma, though, she was the one I worried about. She didn't complain. She never did. But I could see how tired she was. She was still working her part-time jobs, even after everything, and I knew she felt guilty. One day, I came home from work and found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills like they were about to jump up and bite her. "What's wrong?" I asked, even though she just sighed and shook her head. "It's these bills, Maya. We're managing, but barely. I'm just so tired." I didn't know what to say. I mean, I was tired too, but I wasn't going to say that. I had to step up. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'm working full-time now, remember? We'll get through this." She gave me a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're too young to be worrying about bills. This isn't the life I wanted for you." That hit me hard. I could tell she felt guilty, like she'd somehow failed me. But I didn't see it that way. She and Grandpa had raised me, given me everything they could, and now it was my turn to help. I wasn't going to let her carry all that guilt. "Grandma, you did everything for me. I wouldn't be where I am without you and Grandpa. Don't think for a second this is your fault." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. After that, I made it my mission to work harder, take on more shifts, do whatever I could to make sure she didn't have to worry so much. It wasn't easy, but it was what I had to do. A few months went by and things started to settle into a routine. Work, bills, sleep, repeat. It wasn't much of a life, but it was ours. Then, one day, out of nowhere, we got a phone call. It was weird because nobody ever called us. Inai answered, and on the other end was this woman I didn't recognize. "Hello, is this Maya?" she asked. "Yeah, who's this?" There was a pause and then she said, I'm your father's wife." My stomach dropped. My father? I hadn't heard from him in 20 years? And now, all of a sudden, his wife was calling me? I didn't even know he was married. "Okay," I said slowly, not sure what to expect. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your father passed away in a car accident." I didn't feel anything. I mean, what was I supposed to feel? The guy had abandoned me when I was a kid, and now I was supposed to care that he was dead? "I see," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She kept talking, but I barely listened. Something about the accident, the funeral, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't until she said something about inheritance that I snapped back to attention. "Inheritance?" I repeated. "Yes," she said, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "He left behind some assets, and as his biological child, you have a claim to them." Now I was confused. This man hadn't been in my life for years, and suddenly I was entitled to his money? It didn't feel real. I didn't even want anything from him. Why would I? But then she said something that really rubbed me the wrong way. "Would you consider giving up your inheritance rights? It would make things easier for us. I mean, for me. We don't have any kids, and your claim complicates things." I couldn't believe it. She didn't even try to hide what this was about. It wasn't about my father's memory or closure or anything like that. It was about money. And not for me, but for her. She wanted me to just walk away, pretend like I didn't exist so she could have it all to herself. "No," I said firmly. There was a pause. "No," I said again, my voice stronger now. "I'm not giving up anything." I didn't even know about this inheritance. But now that I did, I wasn't just going to give it up because it was convenient for her. She didn't like that answer. "But you didn't even have a relationship with him. What difference does it make to you?" That hit a nerve. "You're right," I said. "I didn't have a relationship with him. He left me with my grandparents and disappeared. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve what's rightfully mine." I could hear her fuming on the other end of the line. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "I don't care if it's fair to you," I snapped. "He was my father, whether he acted like it or not, and I have a right to whatever he left behind." She hung up after that. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't thought about my father in years, and now, all of a sudden, his death was bringing all this drama into my life. I told Grandma about the call, and she wasn't surprised. "I always knew your father was selfish," she said, "but this trying to take everything for herself? That's low, even for him." We decided to consult a lawyer just to make sure we knew what we were getting into. I wasn't sure how much money we were talking about, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to back down. Not after everything we'd been through. I wasn't about to let some stranger, someone who didn't even know me, take something that for once was supposed to be mine. After that phone call with my dad's wife, things escalated quickly. It wasn't just about my inheritance claim anymore. It became this strange battle between me, someone who hadn't seen her father in over 2 decades, and his second wife, who clearly wanted everything for herself. I wasn't trying to be greedy, but the way she came at me, demanding I give up my rights without even a proper conversation, rubbed me the wrong way. So, I dug my heels in. The first thing I did after talking to Grandma was call our family lawyer. He was actually a distant cousin of ours, and I'd only met him a few times growing up, but Grandma swore by him. She called him a straight shooter, which basically meant he didn't mess around with nonsense. I liked that. I didn't want drama. I just wanted to know what my rights were and where I stood in all of this. I sat down with him a few days later, and he went through everything with me. My dad had left behind a decent amount of assets, some savings, property, a few investments here and there. It wasn't like he was rolling in it, but it was more than I expected from someone who had basically ghosted me for most of my life. The part that got me was how much of this was a surprise. I knew nothing about his life after he left. The lawyer said the second wife had been living pretty well, and now that my dad was gone, she wanted to hold on to everything. So what do I do? I asked the lawyer, sitting in his stuffy office, feeling a little out of place. I didn't know anything about legal stuff, especially something like inheritance. I mean, this wasn't exactly something we learned about in school. Well, he said, adjusting his glasses and looking through some papers, you have a claim to half of your father's assets. As his biological child, you're entitled to that, unless you choose to waive your rights. I shook my head. I'm not waiving anything. He smiled a little. I didn't think so, but the other side, meaning your father's wife, is likely to contest it. This could get messy. I didn't really care if it got messy. I wasn't going to let her bully me out of what was mine. But I had to think of Grandma, too. She was still recovering from everything with Grandpa, and I didn't want to drag her into some legal battle. But when I talked to her about it, she was all for me standing my ground. You deserve this, Maya, she said firmly. After everything you've been through, don't let that woman take what's yours. So that was it. We were in. The lawyer filed the necessary paperwork, and it wasn't long before the second wife's lawyer got in touch with mine. Apparently, she wasn't happy about me staking a claim and was prepared to fight. I tried not to think too much about it, but it was hard. I'd come home from work every day wondering if there'd be another call, another piece of paperwork, something else to deal with. It started to consume a lot of my time, which I guess is what legal stuff does. Then, one day, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Grandma was out running errands. I opened the door, and there she was, my dad's wife, standing right on my doorstep. Can we talk? She asked, looking all stressed out, like this whole situation was wearing her down. I didn't really want to, but I figured I'd hear her out. All right, I said, stepping aside so she could come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Grandma and I had talked about everything just weeks before. It felt weird, like I was letting the enemy into my house, but I was curious about what she had to say. I know this must be strange for you, she started, fidgeting with her hands. You didn't have a relationship with your father, so why are you pushing this? Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was clear she was trying to guilt me into backing down. I wasn't having it. I didn't have a relationship with him because he left me, I said, keeping my voice steady. But that doesn't mean I don't have a right to what he left behind, she sighed. But I was his wife. I was there for him when no one else was. I'm not saying you don't deserve something, she replied, but I'm his wife, and I'm his daughter, I interrupted, and I'm not giving up my rights just because it's inconvenient for you. Her face tightened. Inconvenient? You have no idea what this has been like for me. Losing him, dealing with all of this, and now this inheritance battle. You don't even need the money. I felt my blood boil a little at that. How did she know what I needed? She didn't know my life, didn't know the struggles Grandma and I had gone through. "You don't know what I need," I said firmly. "This isn't just about the money, it's about what's fair." She didn't like that answer, but she didn't push back as hard as I thought she would. Instead, she just looked tired. "I just want this to be over," she muttered. "Well, it'll be over when we settle this properly," I said, not backing down. "I'm not giving in just to make things easier for you." There was a long silence after that. She stared down at the table, and I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say next. But whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, she stood up. "I hope you reconsider," she said, her voice flat, like she knew I wouldn't. I didn't say anything as she left, just watched her walk out the door, feeling this weird mix of anger and confusion. I didn't want to fight with her, but I wasn't going to let her push me around either. When Grandma got home later, I told her about the visit. She just shook her head. "She's desperate," Grandma said, "but don't let that change your mind. You're doing the right thing." I hoped she was right. I didn't like how things were playing out, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of me. Not now, not ever again. So, after the visit from my dad's wife, things got even more complicated. The legal stuff was already in motion, and I knew we weren't backing down. I didn't hear from her again directly, but my lawyer sure did. He started getting all these aggressive letters from her side, trying to push for a quick settlement, basically trying to get me to give up, but I wasn't budging. The thing is, this whole situation had started to wear on me. I wasn't sleeping great, and every time the phone rang, I'd get this knot in my stomach, worried it was more drama about the inheritance. Grandma kept telling me to stay strong, but I could tell she was getting tired too. We didn't have the luxury to ignore it. Every day felt like there was a new letter, a new request from their lawyer, trying to get me to give up, and I was starting to feel like I was stuck in a never-ending battle. Then, out of nowhere, my lawyer called me one afternoon while I was at work. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice all tense. I immediately felt my stomach drop. "What now?" I asked, already bracing for the worst. "She's contesting your claim," he explained. "She's saying that your father didn't want you to get anything, that he specifically wanted it all to go to her." I was stunned. "What? How can she say that? There's no will that says that." "Right," he sighed. "Right. But she's claiming that was his intent, that he just never got around to putting it in writing." I couldn't believe it. It felt like every time I thought things were starting to settle, they found a new way to stir it all up again. "So what do we do now?" I asked, feeling more frustrated than anything. "We fight it," he said simply. "She can claim whatever she wants, but unless she's got solid proof, it's not going to hold up in court. It's a scare tactic, plain and simple." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. Every step of this process was just dragging out, making everything more exhausting. Weeks passed, and we kept going back and forth with their lawyers. At one point, they even tried to say I wasn't really his daughter. Yeah, seriously, they were that desperate to get me out of the picture. I couldn't believe the lengths they were going to, just to keep me from getting what was mine. I remember sitting down with Grandma one night, feeling completely drained. "I don't even know why I'm doing this anymore," I told her, slumping down on the couch. Grandma gave me this look, like she knew exactly how I was feeling. "You're doing this because it's the right thing," she said, her voice firm. "Don't let them bully you out of what's yours. Your father might not have been in your life, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve your share." She was right, but it was hard to keep that in mind when it felt like the fight was never going to end. Still, I kept going. We filed responses, showed up to meetings, and basically just kept pushing forward. Then, one day, I got a call from my lawyer that changed everything. "They're offering a settlement," he said, his tone surprised. "A settlement?" I repeated, not quite believing it. What kind of settlement? They're offering to split everything 50-50. No further contest, he explained. They'll drop all their claims and you'll get half of the estate. I sat there stunned. After all the fighting, all the back and forth, they were finally willing to settle. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me felt like maybe I should have kept pushing. Maybe I should have held out for more. But the other part of me was just relieved that this might finally be over. "What do you think?" I asked him. "I think it's a fair offer," he said. "It's what you were entitled to from the start, and it's better than dragging this through court for another year." I nodded. "Okay, let's take it." When I told Grandma about the settlement, she looked relieved too. "I'm proud of you," she said, smiling at me. "You stood your ground. That's what matters." And just like that, it was over. The paperwork was filed, and within a few weeks, the estate was officially divided. I didn't feel the rush of victory or triumph that I thought I might. It was more like this quiet relief, like a weight I'd been carrying around for months, had finally been lifted. We got our share, and it was enough to take care of the bills, put some savings away, and finally let Grandma retire from all those part-time jobs she'd been working. That was the best part of all of this. She didn't have to struggle anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like things were going to be okay. It's funny how things change after everything calms down. After all the drama with the inheritance was finally over, life kind of just moved on. I thought I'd feel different, like I'd have this big moment where I'd finally be able to relax and breathe. And I did, sort of, but not in the way I expected. After we got our share of the inheritance, I focused on making sure Grandma was taken care of. That was always the goal, really. I wanted her to be comfortable, to not have to worry about money or bills or any of that anymore. She'd worked so hard her whole life, especially after Grandpa got sick, and now she didn't have to anymore. That alone made all the stress and fights worth it. But honestly, once everything settled, I found myself feeling kind of empty. It's weird, right? I'd spent so much time fighting, pushing through all the lawyer stuff and thinking about my dad and his wife, that when it was all done, I didn't really know what to do with myself. I guess part of me had always been waiting for some kind of closure. Like maybe I'd get some answers about why my dad left or what his life had been like after he disappeared. But none of that ever came. There was no big revelation, no final piece of the puzzle that made everything make sense. He was just gone. And that was that. One day, Grandma and I were sitting on the porch just watching the sun go down. It was one of those quiet moments where neither of us said much, but I knew we were both thinking about everything that had happened. "You did good, Maya," she said out of nowhere, her voice soft but firm. I looked over at her and smiled. "Thanks, Grandma." She nodded, and then said something I didn't expect. "It's time for you to start thinking about yourself now. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long, but you've got a whole life ahead of you." I didn't really know what to say to that. She was right, of course. I had spent so much time worrying about everyone else. I hadn't really stopped to think about what I wanted, but now, for the first time, I felt like maybe I could. Grandma's words stuck with me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about my future. What did I want to do with my life? Where did I want to go? Who did I want to be? It was overwhelming, to be honest. For so long, my life had been about survival, about getting through each day, about taking care of Grandma. Now, suddenly, there were possibilities. I thought about going back to school, maybe finally pursuing that college degree I'd put on hold. I thought about traveling, seeing the world beyond our small town. I thought about finding love, building a family of my own someday. It was exciting and terrifying all at the same time, but mostly it was liberating. I was free from the financial burdens that had weighed us down for so long, free from the drama and the fighting over my dad's inheritance, and free, in a way, from the grief that had been holding me back. I knew Grandpa would have wanted me to be happy, to live my life to the fullest. And I knew Grandma wanted the same for me, even if she sometimes struggled to say it out loud. So I started making plans. I enrolled in some online courses just to dip my toes back into the world of academia. I started saving up for a trip, somewhere I'd always dreamed of going, and I started putting myself out there, meeting new people, exploring new possibilities. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the grief would hit me out of nowhere, and I'd feel lost and alone. There were times when I doubted myself, wondered if I was making the right choices, but through it all, Grandma was there for me. She was my rock, my constant, my reminder that I was loved and supported no matter what. And slowly but surely, I started to find myself. I rediscovered my passions, my dreams, my hopes for the future. I learned to trust my instincts, to follow my heart, to embrace the unknown. The inheritance battle had been a storm, a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. But like all storms, it eventually passed. And in its wake, I found a new sense of strength, a new appreciation for life, and a new determination to make the most of every moment. I used to think the inheritance was just about the money. And sure, the money helped. It gave us security, a cushion we hadn't had before. But the real inheritance, the one that truly mattered, wasn't something you could put a price tag on. It was the inheritance of strength. The strength that Grandma had shown throughout her whole life, working tirelessly to provide for me, never giving up, never losing hope. The strength that Grandpa had shown in his quiet way, always there, always loving, even when words failed him. And it was the strength that I discovered within myself. The strength to stand up for what was right, to fight for what I deserved, to face the challenges life threw my way. I realized that the inheritance wasn't just about what my dad had left behind. It was about what my grandparents had given me, a foundation of love, resilience, and unwavering support. It was about the lessons they had taught me, the values they had instilled in me, the unwavering belief they had in me. And it was about the person I had become because of them. I still miss Grandpa every day. There's an emptiness in the house that will never truly go away. But I know he's proud of me. I know he's watching over me, along with my mom, and I know Grandma is proud of me too. She tells me all the time, in her own way. With a smile, a hug, a gentle squeeze of my hand. We still sit on the porch sometimes, watching the sun go down, sharing stories and quiet moments. We talk about Grandpa, about the good times, the funny memories. We laugh, we cry, we remember, and we look forward. I'm still figuring things out, still exploring my options, still discovering who I am and what I want to do with my life. But I'm not scared anymore. I know I can handle whatever comes my way, because I have the inheritance of strength, and that's something no one can ever take away from me. So, to anyone out there who's going through a tough time, who feels lost or alone, remember this: you are stronger than you think. You have the strength within you to overcome any obstacle, to achieve any dream. Don't give up. Don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do. Believe in yourself, trust your instincts, and keep moving forward. And never forget the people who love you, who support you, who believe in you. They are your inheritance, your strength, your guiding light. This is Maya, signing off. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, be strong, be brave, be you. Story 2. My parents intended to give their favored daughter my fortune. They had no idea, however, that my grandparents had other ideas. Hello, everyone. To continue providing you with the greatest material, we spend a great deal of time and energy locating these articles. It would be greatly appreciated if you could click the subscribe button if you like what we do. Your assistance is crucial to the success of our adventure and makes all the difference. I appreciate you being here with me. Let's begin the video now. Hey guys, I don't really like posting personal stuff here. The original poster states at the beginning. I need to get this off my chest and hear what you guys think, especially on family matters. I've felt like I've been living in my stepsister Chloe's 25-year-old shadow since I was a little child. She is 3 years younger than me, and she was obviously the star of the show from the day she was born. While Chloe was the golden kid who could do no wrong, I, Ethan, a 28-year-old man, was the calm, trustworthy elder sibling who never caused trouble. My imagination wasn't the only one. My stepmother and father made it painfully clear. After my mother died when I was 12, my stepmother, Melissa, came into our life. I first thought she would be able to unite our family. However, it soon became apparent that she had a favorite, and I wasn't the one. Melissa has always had a greater interest in Chloe's life since she thought she was the ideal daughter. In contrast, Chloe received costly gifts and extravagant birthday celebrations, while I was treated strangely in my own household. I was fortunate enough to receive a pat on the back. I felt pleased of myself when I received honors at my high school graduation. However, my parents didn't even mention it before starting to organize Chloe's dancing performance. Her presence seemed to overshadow all of my accomplishments. Nevertheless, I refused to allow the unbalance define who I was. Determining to make a name for myself, I poured myself into my studies. At the age of 27, I purchased my first home, got a good career in finance, and graduated from college with honors. On the other hand, Chloe lived her life more casually. After 2 semesters, she left college, saying it wasn't for her, and started working part-time at a coffee shop. While I was out on my own negotiating adulthood, she continued to live at home for free. It wasn't envy. In any case, not totally. I was proud of my accomplishments and had put a lot of effort into being independent, so it hurt that we were treated differently. Our parents never anticipated that Chloe would mature, assume personal responsibility, or help out around the house. And that partiality remained in the back of my mind like an old wound that never fully healed, despite the fact that I had constructed a life far apart from their cocoon. And then Grandpa Robert died. He was the only family member to treat Chloe and me fairly. Although I was saddened by his passing, I didn't anticipate that it would alter anything. The family came together to read my grandfather's will after his passing. It was a moment of mixed emotions. I had a lot of respect for him since he had been a self-made guy. I assumed that his children would receive a simple share of his fortune. Even though Grandpa wasn't into drama or games, we were all astonished by what happened in that lawyer's office. Grandpa had accumulated $4 million in wealth. You read correctly. He had bequeathed it to his 5 grandkids and his 3 children equally. My cousins Chloe and I each received around $700,000. I was overcome with emotion as I listened to the attorney read it out loud. I had never dreamed of having so much money before. There are several ways in which this money may transform my life: repaying college loans and launching my ideal company, perhaps even setting away money for my future family. It seemed like a vindication for a minute. Despite my parents' lack of appreciation, Grandpa had always recognized my worth and efforts. I was reminded that I was equally worthy as everyone else in this family, as if he had given me a parting message. Naturally, though, my parents were unable to allow me to experience it. When the lawyer finished reading the contents of the will, Melissa's mouth fell open. "That can't be right," she interrupted him. Melissa was clearly frustrated, but the lawyer patiently reiterated the terms. She shook her head and remarked, "This doesn't make sense." This might be very helpful to Chloe as she continues to struggle to find her feet. Some folks are already stable in the interim. The funds ought to be used where they are most needed. Every time she spoke, her voice raised as though she thought the lawyer would alter the will to please her. Melissa and Dad cornered me in the corridor after the reading. Their faces were not ones of sorrow. It appeared as though they were going to make a sales pitch. As usual, Dad cleared his throat before launching into a serious discussion. "Ethan," he said, his voice brimming with pretended worry, "you don't need this money as much as Chloe does." I was taken aback and blinked. "What?" Melissa intervened, using the deceptive tone she had developed over the years in her voice. I was too familiar with it. "Sweetheart, you're already successful. You have a house and a nice job. You're doing all right She's still learning though, Chloe. She's having trouble. Money was not the only reason for Melissa's desperation. Being the matriarch who kept things together, even at my expense, had become central to her identity. That control was simply enforced by this inheritance. I tried to take in what I was hearing while I looked at them. Are you suggesting that I simply give her my inheritance? They had no right to ask me to sacrifice my future for someone who wouldn't take responsibility for her own. Didn't Chloe need to learn how to be independent? Fairness wasn't the point here. The goal was to allow her to remain in her current location. Well, Dad continued, grinning as if he believed this to be very logical. Naturally, not all of it, perhaps half, or perhaps just enough to start her moving. This was not a recommendation. It was an ultimatum, cloaked in guilt. I crossed my arms and apologized, but this is my money. There's a reason Grandpa left it to me. Melissa's face immediately stiffened. She had a knack for turning a discussion into an excuse to feel guilty. So you're going to hoard all that money while letting your sister suffer? By struggle, do you mean? I fired back. She chooses to work part-time, lives in your basement, and pays no rent. If she's having trouble, it's because you've made it possible for her to escape taking charge of her life. That struck a chord. Dad moved nearer as if he were going to say something, and Mom's face became crimson, but I turned and left before he could. They couldn't use guilt-tripping to get me to give up what was rightly mine. When I got home, I began to plan. Although the inheritance was a gift, there was a chance that it may cause controversy. My parents' actions throughout the reading supported my long-held suspicions. They viewed me as someone who could help Chloe. I wasn't going to allow them to influence me into giving up my future. They wouldn't leave me alone, though. I gave my dad's sister, Aunt Julia, a call the next day. She had always been the family's oddball, independent, outspoken, and unafraid to call out others for their foolishness. She was the only person who could honestly advise me. Julia laughed bitterly when I told her what had happened. "I don't find it surprising," she remarked. "Since your parents have always lavished Chloe with attention, they most likely view this as simply another tactic to shield her from the outside world." Then she said something that chilled me to the bone. Grandpa anticipated this. He included a clause in his will for this reason. Anybody who disputes the distribution loses their portion. He didn't want the family to be destroyed by his wealth. I was a little relieved. Grandpa had anticipated the storm and taken precautions to avoid it, but I knew my folks wouldn't give up lightly, especially with that provision. They were not the kind to concede defeat easily. The inevitable came a few days later. I received a call from Melissa and Dad inviting me to join them for supper. I was aware that the lunch would not be informal. Melissa went into yet another appeal as I sat at their kitchen table, this one laced with emotional blackmail. "We've always done so much for you," she replied, her voice shaking to her words. "To provide you with a wonderful life, we made sacrifices. We just ask that you assist your sister now." "Melissa, is it really so much to ask?" I said, maintaining a steady tone. "Everything I own is the result of a lot of hard work. You and Chloe have nothing to do with this bequest. It has to do with what Grandpa wants. I will not disgrace those either." Dad lost it at that point. "You're being selfish, Ethan," he said, slamming his palm against the table. "Family comes first. If you prioritized money before your sister, Grandpa would be embarrassed." I got up and prepared to leave. Grandpa desired an equal distribution of this money. You may be the one dishonoring him if you are unable to accept that. Shouting matches and guilt trips didn't work for me. I refused to allow them to intimidate me into sacrificing my future since I was no longer a child. However, I knew this was just the beginning when I left their home that evening. I should have known better than to assume that my parents would temporarily distance themselves after the dinner argument. They continued. They intensified their efforts. The guilt trips became full-fledged campaigns. They even enlisted members of my extended family to try to intimidate me into giving up my share, and every phone call was another lecture. Uncle Peter was the worst. Peter was an expert at using everything as an opportunity to teach morality, and he and his father had always been close. During one especially tense phone call, he started, "Ethan, you are prioritizing money over your family. You're superior to this. Your sister's name is Chloe. Blood is what she is. She needs your assistance." Uncle Peter? I'd heard it all before. I answered, attempting to control my annoyance. Grandpa didn't leave me this money to give to another person. He wanted it to be split equally, and that's what's happening. I have no obligation to solve Chloe's issues. Someone must, after all. He felt tense. When the family disintegrates, you'll regret not taking charge. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was somehow held responsible for the family's disintegration, even though I was the only one respecting Grandpa's wishes. Feeling cornered. I looked back at Aunt Julia. She'd been my lifeline in this mess, and as usual, she didn't disappoint. "Don't let them bully you," she added firmly. "Your parents have always placed Chloe first, and now they're frightened because they can't control this scenario. They're used to manipulating her, and they think they can do the same to you. I've been looking into certain things, Ethan, and I think you should know your parents are in significant financial difficulties," she continued. That halted me in my tracks. "What type of trouble?" "Massive debt," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "Credit cards, loans, even their mortgage. I guess that's why they're so keen to get their hands on your money. And Chloe's too." I was startled if what Julia was saying was true. This wasn't simply about partiality or guilt-tripping. My parents were trying to utilize my fortune to bail themselves out of the catastrophe they'd caused. I decided to delve deeper. It didn't take long to confirm Julia's concerns. A few covert talks with distant family members showed that my parents had been living considerably above their means for years. They'd refinanced the house many times, maxed up credit cards, and even taken out personal loans, their luxurious lifestyle. The new vehicle, the vacations, the continual aid they offered Chloe was all based on borrowed money. The worst thing? They were more than simply interested in my inheritance. Chloe's was already being dipped into. Financial documents that Julia discovered revealed that Melissa had persuaded Chloe to give her considerable control over her fortune. It had vanished. She had been persuaded to give my parents control over her portion, claiming it was in her best interests. However, they had used it to settle their obligations and support their lifestyle rather than investing it or putting it aside for her future. I was enraged, but I knew it would be difficult to face Chloe head-on. She had lived her entire life under their control and had always accepted their justifications. I couldn't ignore this, though. I asked Chloe to join me for coffee. She arrived with her typical easygoing demeanor, but I could sense that she was wary. She had likely already been given our parents' version of events after hearing about the altercation. She stirred her latte and said so. "What's going on here?" I inhaled deeply. "I need to discuss your inheritance with you, Chloe." She squinted. "How about it? I am aware that your parents have been taking care of it, but after looking at the records, I can see that a large portion of that money has already been spent." She scowled, obviously perplexed. "Lost? What are you discussing?" I mentioned that they had been using your fortune to settle their obligations. Mortgages, credit cards, and loans. Their financial situation is out of control, and they are rescuing themselves with your money. Chloe laughed, but it was a shaky, incredulous chuckle. "That is absurd." "Chloe, they wouldn't do that," I said softly. "They're not telling you the truth. If you would like, I can show you the records." Her expression changed from skepticism to rage as she gazed at me. "Isn't this simply one more way you're trying to harm their reputation? I've always made you jealous." I remained composed despite the pain of her remarks. "I don't mean to bring them into disrepute. I'm attempting to keep you safe. Chloe, you're being taken advantage of. Look into it at least, even if you don't have to trust me." She stood up and walked away without saying anything. I felt like a failure. as I watched her go. However, Chloe gave me a call a few days later. After our previous conversation, I believed she had changed her mind. But even before she spoke, I could sense the allegation lingering in the air due to her acerbic tone. "You dare?" She gave a hiss. I blinked. "Hello to you as well. Don't act foolish." Mom filled me in on everything. Melissa, whom Chloe had always admired, exploited that influence to manipulate her. "You've always been so resentful of the way they handle me. However, even for you, this is low." I gripped the phone more tightly. "Chloe, what are you talking about? Oh, don't pretend you don't know. You attempted to portray them as robbers. You know how crazy that sounds? I lost my inheritance. Do you think that I'm foolish enough to accept that?" Already tired, I sighed. "Chloe, I'm not attempting to cause trouble. I'm just being honest with you. If you are able to obtain the bank statements, you can even examine them yourself." Her laugh was snorted with a nasty edge. "Bank records. Oh, please. You've been fixated on the notion that they despise you and prefer me. I'm not as much of a pain in the ass as you are, which is why they adore me." It was there. Traditional. Chloe. Our parents weren't the only ones who constructed the golden pedestal on which she lived. She herself had added a couple of bricks. I tried to speak at a level voice and said, "Chloe, I'm not doing this to compete with you. It's not about me here. The goal is to avoid being caught off guard when all of your money is gone." She began to yell, "Is it gone?" And perhaps they had a valid reason, even if it was. You're constantly too preoccupied with feeling sorry for yourself to appreciate how hard they've worked for us. It's not all about you. I tightened my jaw. "What do you know?" "All right. Keep living in your fantasy world, but when reality hits you hard, don't rush to me in tears. Chloe, because it will. It always does." Her chuckle this time was pure mocking. "Yeah, right. You've been incorrect about everything else. Why would this be different?" She hung up before I could utter another thing. For a second, I just gazed at my phone, wondering whether I should have handled it differently. However, Chloe would constantly fall back on the same entitled denial regardless of what I said. She had flung the truth back in my face after I had presented it to her. Allow her to continue believing their falsehoods. The collapse of the House of Cards was inevitable nonetheless. Even if they were caught red-handed, my parents weren't the kind to concede defeat. Rather, they changed their strategy and went from guilt-tripping me to openly demonizing me and the family. They intensified their accusations that I was self-centered and avaricious. Dad contacted as many members of the extended family as he could, making up a tearful tale about how I was destroying the family because of money. Uncle Peter, as was to be expected, embraced it and became their most vocal advocate. Suddenly, passive-aggressive comments about the value of family and how selfishness destroys relationships filled every family group chat. Refusing to participate in their showmanship, I remained silent. It wasn't worthwhile. However, my parents were working on something far more nefarious behind the scenes, while I was preoccupied with avoiding the sounds. It began with a lawyer's letter. A legal notice indicating my parents were challenging Grandpa's will was inside when I opened it. They were arguing that Grandpa wasn't of sound mind when he penned it, even though the forfeiture provision specifically forbade anybody from contesting the distribution. It was obvious that they intended the entire estate to be dispersed, perhaps to Chloe's and their own benefit. Days went by, and the court case started. It became hard to overlook my father's and Melissa's blatant entitlement. Melissa, the wounded matriarch, was ready to change Grandpa's obvious intentions to fit her idea of justice, making every court appearance feel like a theatrical spectacle. Melissa was yelling loudly to everyone who would listen outside the courthouse, displaying her entitlement. She raged, "This isn't just about money. What's best for our family is at stake. Ethan is attempting to take what should have gone to Chloe, despite the fact that he has no idea how much we have done for him. She talked as if she had made the decision on the inheritance, as though her own idea of justice were more important than Grandpa's wishes. It seemed unbelievable to me. They were jeopardizing their own portion of the wealth by contesting the will, not only Chloe's or mine. It was a rash, desperate decision that was a clear indication of their financial difficulties. However, money was no longer the only consideration. It has to do with control. Melissa had always presented herself as the family's pillar of support, even at the expense of others. Being the matriarch who held Chloe on a pedestal and everyone else in line was the foundation of her identity. I quickly contacted Aunt Julia. "The will is being contested," I informed her, my voice hardly able to contain my rage. Julia let out a deep sigh. "They are, of course. They believe they can intimidate you into giving in. Do you believe they're I inquired. "Of course not," she responded firmly. "When Grandpa wrote that, he was as shrewd as ever. If it comes down to it, Will and I will attest to it. Even so, the prospect of a protracted court struggle was draining. My parents couldn't accept reality. Therefore, I didn't want to be stuck in court for months or even years. I was getting ready to reply to the legal notice. I got a call from Chloe. She spoke in an arrogant and derisive tone. I was aware that this would not be a cordial exchange. The instant her voice reached my ears, well, she laughed sarcastically. It appears that there are other people who have thoughts concerning my fortune besides you." I scowled. "Chloe, what are you talking about?" "Oh, simply that I had to sign some documents that Mom and Dad brought over to ensure that everything goes smoothly for me," they explained. "It's all about completing the will paperwork." The final word was virtually a purr from her. My blood pressure started to rise. "Don't be a fool, Chloe. They are attempting self-defense. Have you read the document you are signing?" She gave a fictitious gasp. "I apologize. I forgot." "Now, you are the family attorney. Big brother, don't be concerned. I have far more faith in them than in you. And to be honest, your level of pressure over this is kind of funny. Do you feel afraid? Will I get your share in the end?" I didn't answer. I just hung up. I didn't have time for her. No sense. Anger was shaking my hand. I had given up on rescuing someone who would not accept reality. Chloe was able to relish her moment of dominance. She would discover it after it was too late. I made the decision to face them by myself. If they believed they could take advantage of everything and steal my money by pretending to be assisting Chloe, I couldn't afford to overlook this. They were gravely wrong. Melissa opened the door with that phony, sugary smile she always wore when attempting to deflect, as though she and my dad had done nothing when I arrived at their house. "What a surprise, Ethan," she replied, taking a step back. "Enter." I wasted no time at all. "We must discuss the will and this absurd litigation." Although her smile wavered, she was able to keep her typical condescending tone. "You're making such a huge deal out of this, Ethan. We're acting in the family's best interests. For Chloe, you should be supporting us in this, not battling us." Dad was already defensive as he entered from the kitchen. He slammed his coffee mug on the counter, his cheeks flushed. Melissa is correct. Making sure Chloe has all she needs to get back on her feet is the goal here. You're being self-centered. I sneered. "Please don't disparage my intelligence. It has nothing to do with Chloe. You two are attempting to get my portion of the inheritance. Now that you've spent all of her money, you want to continue the gravy train. Let's not act as though this is about assisting anybody other than ourselves, particularly you, Melissa. The fuzz is being made by you." Melissa's face became cold. "You have no right to accuse us of such." She gave a hiss. "Our goal is to keep this family safe. We are taking the required steps to ensure that Chloe receives the help she needs. I told you to feel ashamed of yourself for believing differently. You mean you're bailing yourselves out of debt with her money and mine? That isn't assistance, it's stealing. In an attempt to make up for your errors, you are now pursuing my inheritance. It is evident that Grandpa's will has a forfeiture provision. You will lose everything if you continue to pursue this lawsuit. Dad's hand was shaking with rage as he pointed a finger at me. You have no idea what you're discussing. We're doing everything we can to support Chloe, who has endured a lot. You might notice that if you weren't so avaricious. Greedy. I gave a sour laugh. You are the ones who have been spending money that isn't yours. Chloe is not the reason you are doing this, it's for your own benefit. Furthermore, you are quite mistaken if you believe that I will simply roll over and give you my share. There was a profound quiet in the room. Melissa's facial emotions are inexplicable, and Dad appeared to be about to blow up. I didn't care, though. They were left to wallow in their deceptions and manipulations as I turned and left. After making their decisions and bringing up the case, they would now have to deal with the fallout. I had finished their game. I was prepared to make sure they lost everything if they chose to fight. They then proceeded with the case because they were desperate, taking the fight to new heights that I never would have imagined. I was forced to relive every moment of my grandfather's last months, their financial machinations, and the many conflicts that had shattered our family as they dragged me into interminable depositions. It was emotionally taxing, a never-ending assault of charges and false stories intended to paint me as the bad guy. It was like entering a combat zone every time I appeared in court. A slick, arrogant lawyer for my parents enjoyed portraying me as the ungrateful, cunning grandson who somehow forced Grandpa to write them out of the will. They said that I had tricked Grandpa into include the forfeiture provision, that he hadn't been of sound mind, and that the entire estate plan was a ruse to unfairly exclude them. However, I wasn't fighting this battle alone. As promised, Aunt Julia was there to support me. With her attendance at every hearing and deposition and her testimony that sliced through their falsehoods like a knife, she turned into my strongest ally. She talked resolutely about Grandpa's unmistakable goals, his keen intellect till the last, and his contempt for anybody who attempted to use or manipulate the family inheritance. During her evidence, she informed the court that he was a man of morals and that he was quite clear about his desires. He was not influenced by Ethan, because Ethan had earned it. He respected him. His memory is a shame because of this case. Although her statements were significant, the case took months to resolve. My parents held fast to their illusions, arguing with the court about whatever they could think of in the hopes that it would stay. Depositions evolved into interrogation-like cross-examinations. It was tiring as their lawyer attempted to dissect my motivations and character, but I resisted. The submission of the financial records as proof marked a sea change. The debts, the misappropriation of Chloe's inheritance, and their obvious attempts to alter history to suit their own interests were all exposed by the records. No amount of spin could reverse the damage. It was damning. It felt unreal on the last day of court. The judge went over everything, the financial records, the testimony, the will, and produced a decision that was refreshing. The court strongly said that the will was unambiguous and that the evidence supported its legitimacy. The forfeiture provision is enforceable, and the allegations of improper influence are baseless. As stated, the plaintiff's portion of the inheritance is forfeited. It was over in an instant. My parents lost everything. All the money they had been relying on. Their expressions at the time were a mixture of amazement, anger, and incredulity. It was a bittersweet win. I didn't want things to go this bad, but there was nothing else I could do to keep myself and Grandpa's legacy safe. It was difficult to overlook the wounds from the struggle, even if I felt a sense of justice after they had forced my hand. The fight was finished, but it would take time to recover. After the loss, Melissa and Dad's anger remained unrelenting. They tried to slant the story in their favor and disseminate their resentment around, disparaging me to anybody who would listen. Am unable to provide them. Now, every phone conversation with distant family members served as a battlefield for their story. This family has been devastated by you. One especially nasty call ended with Dad growling. We have lost everything because of your greed. I reacted incredulously. It was you who risked all to try and seize what wasn't rightfully yours. You are responsible for this. It was draining. Chloe wasn't resisting the influence of our parents. She had previously sided with them, supporting their deceit throughout the legal proceedings. She continued to insist that our parents were the victims of my avarice, even after the judge handed down the decision that deprived them of their inheritance. She separated from me for months following the court proceedings. She accused me of causing the family to fall apart in our sharp and acerbic talks. However, her allegiance started to erode with time. She began to receive more financial pressure from our parents, who were now in dire straits. Chloe quickly came to the conclusion that their assurances of assistance were only empty rhetoric. They had no intention of assisting her. She was being used by them. The family wasn't all that understanding. Always the self-appointed protector of family loyalty, Uncle Peter made it his goal to constantly remind me of my alleged betrayal. He cornered me with his coffee during one family gathering. You ought to make an effort to mend your relationship with your parents. Ethan, you're the reason they're having difficulties. You are aware. I let out a sigh. The conversation has already worn me out. They have been mismanaging money and misleading people for years, which is why they are floundering. I'm not responsible for it. He gave me a finger wag. He blushed. It makes no difference. Their son is you. It is your duty to take charge. I didn't try to hide how frustrated I was. Uncle Peter, with respect, why don't you help them if you believe they deserve it so much? Or is it simpler to give me a lecture than to do action? After everything I've experienced, I believe I grew courageous. He marched away, cursing to himself as his face flushed a striking shade of crimson. It wasn't much, but I was glad to be able to defend myself at last. I began to realize the advantages of being tough, even if there was still conflict with some family members. My school loans, which had been a major burden on my shoulders, were paid off thanks to my inheritance. I made a little business investment. My idea was to launch a financial advisory business that would assist young professionals in managing their money. I had the impression that I was at last taking charge of my life in a way that went beyond money. In the meantime, without our financial assistance or their inheritance, my parents were in a downward spiral. Their circumstances were increasingly unstable. They moved into a smaller rental property that they could hardly afford after selling their home. They continued to blame me for everything rather than owning up to their mistakes. They're informing everyone that you left them behind. One day, while going through texts from a distant relative, my aunt stated, "They seem to be attempting to alter history. Permit them." I said, "The truth is known by those who are important. The scars were still there." Rebuilding my feeling of self-worth took time since the betrayal was so painful. However, each step I took to become financially, emotionally, and psychologically independent was a step away from their authority. Grandpa left me more than just money. I inherited his strength, his morals, and his steadfast faith in justice, and that it was worth fighting for above everything else. Story 3. In order to support my deadbeat sister boyfriend, my parents increased my rent. They are now pleading with me for assistance after I departed. Hello, this is my first time posting. I'm Alex, a 23-year-old man, and lately my life has been somewhat hectic. Normally, I wouldn't disclose such private information, but I need to vent and hear what you think. With 2 part-time jobs and a full-ride scholarship, I'm now a college student working hard to make ends meet. On paper, living at home with my parents seems fantastic because there is no rent to pay. It's not as simple as it seems, I assure you. You see, I have a 25-year-old sister named Kara, who is the family's official golden child. And by golden child, I mean that she is capable of making a huge mess. And like she's the second coming of Christ, my folks will find a way to spend it. I'll give you an example. If Kara brought home a C on her report card as a child, she could do no wrong. Like, she would desire a Nobel Prize, my parents would celebrate it. She did her best. Meanwhile, they would claim that if I received a B rather than an A, it was. Alex, what happened to you? You're more intelligent than this. Kara was the kind of person who hardly did any housework. She doesn't like it. My parents would dismiss her failure to clean the dishes by stating that she must have been very busy with her friends. However, it was a full speech on how I needed to be more responsible if I neglected to take out the garbage. However, it doesn't end there. Greg, Kara's ex-boyfriend, was the worst person ever. He was, to put it plainly, a user, manipulative, and dominating. Kara couldn't see that Greg had her tethered to his finger. He would continuously beg money from her while guilt-tripping her by saying that he needed assistance to get back on his feet. You know what? Never did. For a while, Kara had a respectable profession, but Greg's dubious activities, such as his failing music career and sporadic vacations with his friends, seemed to be financed with every penny. Even worse, I was urged to keep my distance since I didn't understand their relationship when I attempted to call out Greg's blatant manipulation. My parents weren't really helpful. They would dismiss it by saying that Kara is an adult. Give her the freedom to choose. Which, all right. However, Greg finally broke up with her and left her bankrupt. You know who my parents turned to for support? Me. Don't misunderstand me. I didn't despise Kara as a child. Even though she wasn't cruel to me, it was difficult to overlook her preference as we grew older, and I was struggling academically. Life was coasting for Kara. She didn't bother going to college, barely made it through high school, and began working at odd retail jobs that lasted no more than a few months. Naturally, my parents had always made allowances for her. She's still getting to know herself. When I received my scholarship and enrolled in college, I believed that perhaps things would finally change. I was working hard, preparing for the future, getting high marks, and doing everything correctly. However, no. When Kara was hired by a boutique last year, she was still the main attraction. My parents pretended that she had won a seat in Congress. They said, "She's working so hard. She spends half of her income on unnecessary items, and the store hardly gives her the minimum wage." I was glad when Kara eventually moved out into her own apartment. At last, I thought, some peaceful time. However, that was short-lived. It began with my mother's brief remarks. Kara is struggling to pay her rent. One night, as we were watching TV, my mother commented. Her voice was tentative, as if there were more. She didn't say anything. I assumed that wasn't my problem and simply nodded. My mom said, "She's trying so hard, but things are just so expensive," I answered, without really listening. "Yeah, I guess." The actual discussion took place a few weeks later. I was seated at the dining table by my parents, as if we were about to talk about a life or death matter. "We've been conversing, Alex. My father got things started." "Oh, half joking, but already filled with dread," I said. My mother jumped right in. "We're quite proud of you since you're doing so well in school. That scholarship is yours. You're putting in a lot of effort. You're putting yourself in a great position to succeed. Regards." Still not sure where this was headed? I said. Kara is currently having difficulties. She went on to say that her work doesn't pay enough to cover everything, and her rent is quite exorbitant. I scowled. "All right. We were also contemplating. My dad suggested that because you're living here for free and saving a lot of money from your scholarship, you might be able to lend her a hand for a few months until she's able to support herself." I gazed at them, anticipating the joke. It never arrived. "Would you like me to cover Kara's rent?" My voice was louder than I meant when I asked, "Is she your sister?" As if that clarified everything, my mother remarked. I said, "She's an adult. She ought to sort things out on her own. She's making an effort. Alex." With a severe tone, my dad remarked, "Not everyone is as fortunate as you have been. You have the opportunity to assist, and it is only right." "Just?" I fired back. How is it fair that I attend school full-time and work 2 jobs? I now have to cover Kara's expenses as well. You're being self-centered. My mother shook her head as if I had just kicked a pet. If it were the other way around, Kara would assist you. I had significant doubts about that. For what seemed like hours, we argued. I informed them that I was already overburdened, that it wasn't my job, and that Kara needed to learn how to take care of herself. However, my parents refused to change. Are you related to her? My mother lost her temper. While you swim, you would let her to drown? My dad also mentioned that she will soon receive a raise. Only 3 months had passed. She will reimburse you. I told them I would give it some thought and then went to my room to ask myself some questions. How much should I donate? If Kara continues to struggle or spend, 3 months could become 6, then a year. Will I have to continue to save her? My main goal is to determine whether or not I'm mistaken for feeling this way. Is it better for me to just pay her rent and keep things amicable? Or are I justified in believing that this entire circumstance is unjust? Although I've always been the one to maintain harmony within the family, this is really getting to me. I'm sick of constantly having to make sacrifices while Kara gets away with it, and that's my problem. Should I remain silent and allow the animosity to fester? Or should I take a stand and risk upsetting my family? If anyone has experienced something similar, I would be very interested in knowing how they handled it. I'll post here once I've decided. Keep an eye out. One point should be updated. All right, Alex, it's your butt. I finally gave in. I wasn't exactly given many options by my parents. They continued to heap on the guilt by claiming that you were in a position to assist Alex, or that Kara would do the same for you. Family is what it is. So I did agree. I reasoned that perhaps assisting her would keep the peace and that the argument wasn't worth it. I feel like I've been set up, though, now that I'm sitting here and considering the wider picture. As soon as I began sending her money, Kara pretended as if it were the most natural thing ever. No gratitude at all. No recognition of the sacrifices I was making to support her. Rather, she continued to do what she always does, posting Instagram posts of her newest shopping hauls, brunch escapades, and expensive coffee beverages that cost more than my daily lunch budget. At first, I tried to ignore it. Perhaps she's spending her own money on that, I told myself. Perhaps she's making cuts elsewhere. However, the more it continued, the more difficult it became to believe. Last week was the turning moment. Kara posted a story of herself at a spa with the caption, "Self-care weekend self-care." She takes spa weekends while I work 2 jobs and pay her rent. That's when I decided to ask my mom about it. So Kara's rent is all covered now, right? I asked, trying to sound casual. Indeed. Thank you for assisting her. My mom said, apparently satisfied with herself for organizing this. Cool. Just wondering, does she, need more help? I asked. What do you mean? Well, I said, choosing my words carefully. She doesn't seem very stressed. I mean, she's been shopping and going to spa. Doesn't really look like someone who's struggling. My mom gave me a look like I just insulted the Pope. Alex, she's entitled to enjoy herself. Just because she's having a hard time doesn't mean she can't take a break every now and again. Sure, but how is she financing all this? I pushed. She's using her own money for it. You don't have to micromanage her life. Micromanage? I'm the one paying her rent and I don't get to ask questions. I let it go, but the frustration was bubbling over. The more I thought about it, the more I knew something wasn't adding up. Kara was expected to be impoverished. I continued to follow her on social media. She seemed to be trying to avoid too many questions by keeping her Instagram captions cryptic, living my life to the fullest. I read one post. I couldn't explain why I wasn't attempting to take charge of Kara's life, but it didn't set well with me. I was only trying to figure out how this circumstance made sense. However, she avoided the question or changed the topic whenever I inquired about her difficulties. She would remark, "It's just complicated," which further increased my suspicions. However, I realized that I would not succeed with Mom. I dropped it then. My doubts were sown by that exchange, and they only got stronger over time. I began listening more intently, searching for any clue as to why Kara was able to live so nicely in spite of her alleged financial difficulties. I heard Kara talking on the phone one evening when I was back at my parents' place. She was speaking quietly in her former bedroom. "No, I'll send it tomorrow like I promised. Just stop worrying, please," she begged. I went cold. To whom was she transferring funds? I was the one paying her rent, wasn't I? I remembered something my cousin Matt had said a few weeks prior, but I didn't want to draw any conclusions too quickly. "Were you aware that Kara and Greg had been spending time together once more?" While leaning on the counter during a family cookout, Matt commented informally. I scowled. "Greg? Her former partner." "Hello?" Matt gave a shrug. "I don't know." I caught sight of them in the coffee shop near her home. It seemed comfortable. After pausing, he said, "Have you noticed that Kara has been acting strangely?" "Strange how?" I squinted as I asked. He took a sip of his drink and responded, "I don't know. More than usual, she has been quite private, as if she's concealing something significant." His remarks stayed with me, even though I shrugged them off. What may Kara be concealing? A deadbeat who would suck Kara for years before she eventually broke up with him. Greg was meant to be a thing of the past. Or so I believed, the way Matt brought him up, like if it hadn't ended yet. Give me a nod. I regret not paying attention to it at the time. I made the decision to look further. I went home that evening and looked for Kara's account on Venmo. Snooping made me feel a bit bad, but I told myself that I had a right to know where my money was going. Finding what I was seeking for didn't take long. Greg received several regular payments. The captions lacked clarity. "For food. You have to give me one." "Once again, thank you." I tried to understand that my money wouldn't be much more than rent while I gazed at the phone screen. It was for her former partner. The knowledge came to me suddenly. She was using money to support someone who had previously abused her once, while I was working extra hours and reducing everything to aid her. I stewed in rage and incredulity for the remainder of the night. I'm not sure if I should address her right now or wait and consider my options. The money is no longer the main concern here. It has to do with the lies. I will probably confront Kara because I have a lot of questions for her. I will update you. Update the second colon. Alex, hello. Once more? It blew up much more than I anticipated. Making a big deal wasn't my intention, but when you're pushed to the limit, things just happen. Just a brief aside. The only person in my corner at the moment is my cousin Matt. You know, the guy who knows everyone's business. He's been listening to me complain about everything, and he even forewarned me that Kara might start seeing Greg again. "If you don't handle it, she'll keep walking all over you," he said, persuading me to confront her. "She's accustomed to your silence." Armed with my frustration and Matt's support, I made the decision to speak with Kara directly. Matt accompanied me to Kara's apartment that weekend. If something went wrong, I needed a backup, someone who could keep me grounded. I knew she was home because her car was parked outside when we arrived. After Matt nodded, I rapped on her door. Kara pulled it open, looking taken aback. Not in a positive way either. Her body was rigid as her gaze shifted between Matt and me. "Why have you all come here?" Leaning against the doorframe, she posed the question. I said, "We need to discuss." She sighed, gazing back into her apartment. "Alex, this is not a good moment. Unfortunately." Before she could stop me, I said, "Going inside." Matt followed, slamming the door behind him. Her flat was immaculate, but the tension in the air was high. Kara crossed her arms, her look wary. "What's going on here?" I wasted no time, Greg. Her face paled. "What about him?" "You've been sending him money." "I know that." I spoke in a forceful yet composed tone. "The rent money that I have been giving you." "Kara, I've seen the payments. Don't tell me lies." Matt was standing close to the door. She was given a look that indicated, "Don't even try to weasel out of this," with her arms crossed. Kara's jaw tensed and she remained silent for a while. Then she sneered, "Whoa." Alex peeking into my Venmo. Elegant. Avoid deflecting. Matt, cut in. Simply respond to the query. After giving him a fierce look, she turned back to face me. "All right. I have been assisting Greg, yes. He's in a difficult situation." "All right." "A tough spot," I remarked, raising my voice. "Are you serious, Kara? You're taking my money to help Greg, who caused you to be broke in the first place? You don't understand." She lost her temper. "I knew you would flip out like this, so I didn't want to tell you. I'm stressing out, of course." I yelled. "To assist you, I have been working 2 jobs, and all along you have been deceiving me. Telling lies? I told the truth." Defensively, she said, "I simply kept it from you. I stated exactly the same thing. Are Dad and Mom aware about this?" Her face flushed as she froze. "They don't have to either. They will indeed." I turned to face the door and stated that. "Hold on, Alex." With a hint of terror in her voice, she spoke. "No," I answered firmly. "This is plenty for me." On the way, Matt and I drove directly to my parents' house. "You're doing the right thing," he said often. "The truth must be revealed to them." Kara can't continue to be the victim. My folks were watching TV in the living room when we arrived. I entered without even making an effort to sit down. I said, "We need to discuss." With a worried expression, my mother turned the TV off. "What's happening?" "It concerns Kara." My voice was steady as I spoke. "She has been deceiving us all. She's not having trouble covering her rent. Greg has been receiving money from her." My father's brows went up. "Her ex, Greg." "Yes. I did mention the same man who had been abusing her for years. I've been sending her money, but she's been transferring it to him." My mother's expression tightened, and I briefly believed they were going to be upset with Kara. "I think you're overreacting, Alex," she remarked with a sigh. I blinked. "What?" "She has been deceiving us. She is attempting to assist a loved one." "You have no idea what Greg is going through," my mother said. "What I was hearing, and what Greg was going through, astounded me. How about what I'm experiencing? You guilted me into helping Kara, so I've been working tirelessly to do so. You're defending her now, too." "Alex, relax," my father said in a firm voice. "Is your sister here, Kara? Family supports family. Are you serious?" My voice broke as I spoke. "After everything she's done, you're actually going to support her?" "She is not flawless," my mother said. "She's trying her hardest, though." "No, she isn't." My rage boiled over as I spoke. "She has been deceiving, controlling, and using me. You're also allowing her to get away with it?" "Alex, enough." With a stern voice, my father said, "We're done talking." My chest heaved with rage as I stared at them and realized what I had been ignoring for years. Kara would never be held responsible by them. "All right," I said, grabbing my keys. "If you're not going to take action, I will." I bounded out. Matt is just behind me. "Well, that went about as expected," he observed to me as we arrived at the car. "Yes, with bitterness," I said. "They will always be the same." A few days later, while I was washing out a coffee mug in the sink, the knocking on the door drew me away. It was late. The sound alone was enough to make me nervous because my parents were asleep and I wasn't expecting anyone. Greg was standing there looking like he was in hell as I answered the door. Sweaty, unkempt, and swaying a little. "What on earth do you desire?" I gripped the door's edge and asked. Greg ignored me and brushed by me. As if he owned the room, he brushed crumbs off the couch's arm before settling down on it. He tipped his head back and sighed loudly, as though he had just returned from a major conflict. Kara is not picking up her fucking phone. At last, he glared up at the ceiling as he spoke. "She doesn't reside here, yes?" I slammed the door shut, more difficult than required. "You're here, but why?" Greg didn't answer my query. "She believes she can simply interrupt me in that manner. Don't let my child near me." "No, not taking place." My heartbeat accelerated as I froze in mid-step. "What are you discussing?" With a skewed smile on his face, he cocked his head in my direction. "Alex, please don't act foolish." I didn't reply, you know. Greg straightened his posture and grinned broadly upon realizing that I truly didn't understand what he was talking about. "She didn't tell you," he remarked with a hint of joy. Naturally, she didn't. I wouldn't want to ruin her idyllic tale. "Tell me what?" With a strong voice, I demanded. Greg put his elbows on his knees and leaned forward. With a long pause, he replied, "Your dear sister has a child, my child, 2 years old." I simply stood there looking at him for a while. Like he was waiting for the explosion, he watched me while leaning back on the couch. "You're telling lies." Despite the lack of confidence in my voice, I eventually uttered it. Greg laughed loudly. "Yes, she would like you to believe that. But it's the truth, dude. I've been getting paid by her to remain silent. Doesn't want anyone to realize that she isn't as flawless as her parents would have us believe." The sledgehammer-like words struck. Kara had concealed the fact that she had a kid from me and everyone else. With a sigh of exaggerated annoyance, Greg scratched his face once again. "She, after all, has you paying the bills, doesn't she? Living the good life without becoming involved with my own children's lives." Man, it's nonsense. His remarks were heavy and thick in the air. As the parts began to come together, my stomach rumbled. She usually used the same defensive answer when I questioned her about her financial situation. "It's not easy." If I pressed her, she'd snap. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered, her cheeks flushed. I assumed she was simply embarrassed at the time. I now question whether she was concealing anything more significant. However, I've learned better. The Instagram photos of breakfasts and shopping excursions, as well as the money flowing to Greg. My money is being sent to you by her. I made more of a declaration than a query. Greg grinned and shrugged. "I guess you're not as ignorant as I assumed." Before I could stop it, the anger erupted. I tightened my hands and took a step closer. I growled, "Get out." Greg rose slowly and raised his hands in a gesture of simulated submission. Okay, I'm going. However, you inform Kara that she has no power to change the past. It's not over yet." He staggered out into the darkness when I opened the door and stood there gazing at him. After he departed, the home was so quiet that it seemed oppressive. My thoughts were racing as I perched on the edge of the couch. Kara gave birth to a kid. She had told everyone a falsehood. It was inconvenient for her, not because she was afraid or embarrassed. She claimed to be enjoying her best life on Instagram, concealing secrets and using the money I gave her to silence Greg. This wasn't how someone who was having a hard time making ends meet behaved. Kara wasn't having any trouble. She kept up her luxurious lifestyle by coasting and taking advantage of everyone around her. And worst of all, I was pulled to her own trash by her. I was unable to sit still the next morning. The rage was simmering under the surface, ready to explode at any second. The only person I knew who wouldn't sugarcoat things was Matt, so I gave him a call. Last night, Greg arrived to the house. When he picked up, I said, "Why?" Matt inquired, his voice already doubtful. He was raving about Kara and their child while intoxicated. There was a silence. "What?" "She has a child." With bitterness, I said. 2 years old. Greg has been paying her to hide it. Matt blew a little whistle. "That's screwed up, man. And your folks are unaware?" "Obviously not." I said. "They would most likely still manage to defend her even if they did." "Oh," I said sourly, "she's trying her hardest." Matt didn't chuckle. "But you're correct. They will stop at nothing to protect her. That being said, Alex, you cannot overlook this. You have been used by her. It's not simply a horrible thing. It is inhumane. Yes, I did say that, and I'm finished." "All right," Matt answered firmly. "What is the plan then?" I took a while to respond. Already my mind was racing with ideas for what to do next. Because of individuals like me, Kara had been able to get away with everything her whole life. That was about to change. She believes she can continue to walk all over me. Finally, I said, but she's going to see how mistaken she is. I meant it, too. Making amends and preserving the family unit were no longer the goals here. It was about ensuring Kara dealt with the fallout from the life she had constructed on deceit and deception. She wasn't going to get away with it this time. I'm thinking of something witty, to make sure they reconsider before tampering with me once more. If you're interested, wait for my next update. 3.0 update. Hello everyone, this is Alex once more, and I'm about to spill the beans. Well, the eviction notice came as a shock when I was preparing my next course of action. It was not my intention to open it. Although it was delivered to my parents' residence, it was addressed to Kara. The envelope was already partially ripped when I discovered it on the counter. Would I lose up on this chance to learn more about Kara's mess? Absolutely not. I pulled out the letter. I looked over the lines. After months of the landlord complaining about overdue rent, Kara was finally being evicted. The letter was put back on the counter by me. Simmering under the surface was a mixture of grim satisfaction and rage. Her mess was this. She had succeeded. But I was aware of the outcome. As usual, my parents would run to soften Kara's fall as she spun this. Kara had her luggage draped over her shoulder when she arrived that night. She walked about the home with her typical lack of interest. She helped herself to a cup of coffee, placed her belongings on the kitchen counter, and hardly acknowledged me. Where I had left the eviction notice was still there. Its presence screamed in the room's quiet. I waited. When she spotted the envelope, she hesitated for a while before tearing it open. Her expression hardly moved as her gaze swept across the message. As if nothing had occurred, she sighed in frustration, threw the paper on the counter, and picked up her cup. It was her go-to strategy. Until someone else cleans it up, ignore the storm. Soon after, my parents entered, their words upbeat until they noticed Kara's face. While reading the letter, my mother's fingers shook a little. My dad's face tensed as he took in the words, hovering over her shoulder. They spoke very little. While my dad tightened his teeth and gazed at the letter, my mom put a hand on Kara's arm and said something reassuring. As they swiftly reverted to their typical roles, the atmosphere in the room changed. The victim, Kara, my folks, the saviors. With my fists clenched at my sides, I watched the entire act unfold from the corner. Kara's bags returned to her previous room in a few days. My parents planned the relocation with such calm efficiency that it made my stomach turn, and everything went well. They didn't even tell me about the eviction, as if it were an unwritten contract I didn't have to be aware of. However, the reality was already beginning to come apart. Late one evening, I heard my parents conversing in low tones, and that was the last piece. Child and Greg's comments sliced like a dagger through the walls. When I learned they had known all along about Greg, the child, and everything else, my stomach fell. They hadn't told me either. I was the only one they utilized. I took the initiative the following morning, silently, with caution. I collected all of my available evidence, Venmo exchanges, screenshots of Kara's Instagram, which included notes about her ridiculous lifestyle, and all the excuses she had ever offered me. After that, I called her landlord. Although courteous, the woman on the other end was forceful, evidently annoyed by Kara's pranks. I told her that I knew Kara had been transferring funds to other places while neglecting her rent, and she listened intently. With a change in tone when she recognized the extent of Kara's deceit, the landlord thanked me. Without any delay, Kara's landlord lodged an official complaint, putting more pressure on the eviction procedure. Kara's response was expected. Muttering about how unjust everything was, he stormed about the house, banging doors. My parents came together to support her, making excuses and providing consolation. They are disregarding the havoc she left behind and are just concerned about Kara. I avoided getting in their path. This time, my quiet served as a reminder that I wasn't complying. I simply shook my head and left when my mom eventually approached me and asked for assistance in getting Kara back on her feet. Kara was seated at the kitchen table, looking through her phone as if nothing had occurred. when I last saw her. My parents lingered close by, talking about ways to assist her in finding a new apartment and offered to pay for her bills until she got back on track. I left the house that day with a clean mind after packing my belongings. Let them handle the consequences. Allow Kara to discover what transpires when her deceptions are eventually exposed. I left without feeling guilty for the first time. I had no intention of repairing all the bridges she had destroyed. She was alone herself this time. I have no idea what the future will bring. I'll probably give you one last update so you know if things improve or go worse. The last update? Hey, it's Alex once more. Since everything has now calmed down, I thought I owed you all one final update. After the eviction notice and all that followed, Kara returned to live with my parents, and everything went precisely as I had anticipated. Even though it was the most obvious result imaginable, they pretended it was some great gesture of selflessness. My parents went into damage control mode right away, going above and above to ensure their golden kid was comfortable. To assist her in adjusting, they tidied up her previous room, filled the refrigerator with all of her favorite foods, and even took time off work. Kara, meantime, pretended that her presence was a courtesy. She never once admitted the catastrophe she had created or the falsehoods that lead her there. Greg, on the other hand, continued his foolishness. He has apparently been threatening to take legal action to get custody of the child, but Kara is responding to it in the same avoidant and denial-based manner that she handles everything. Naturally, my parents accept all she says about Greg's attempts to ruin her life. It's funny that they never pause to inquire as to why she first concealed any of these information. However, my parents did attempt to re-engage me in it. A week after Kara moved in, my mom gave me a call. There was a false cheerfulness in her voice. "Like it's some noble crusade," she added. "We're all pulling together to help Kara." "Alex, your assistance would be greatly appreciated." "Assistance?" Trying not to laugh, I said. "Do you mean cash?" She hesitated for a long moment before acknowledging it. "She only requires a little assistance to get back on her feet. Alex, you're doing well. That's what families do." "Family?" I said. "Do you mean the family?" For years, she spent my money on Greg while lying to the family she controlled. God knows what more there could be. "Alex, she's your sister. When my mother doesn't get her way, she always speaks in a tone of disappointment. She's making an effort." "No, Mom," I firmly responded. "She isn't. I'm also not going to save her again." Before she could further guilt me, I hung up. Weeks later, I've taken a total backseat. I haven't visited the residents. Their calls have gone unanswered by me. Stayed out of their turmoil. Kara continues to reside there, continuing to let my parents deal with her issues while she makes the minimal effort to survive. The distinction is that I'm no longer involved. I feel free for the first time in years. No more getting pulled into disaster I didn't make. No more enabling, no more guilt. I'm concentrating on my future, my career, my education, and myself. It's uncertain to me if Kara will ever change. Sincerely, I don't think so. Until she is 40, my parents will most likely continue to support her and continue to blame others for her issues. However, I no longer have that issue. I appreciate your patience with me during this fiasco. If I've learnt anything, it's that sometimes leaving is the greatest thing you can do for yourself, even if it comes from relatives. Be careful, everyone. Alex.